This is not the story of kings. It is not the story of conquest, of crowns, or of men whose names were carved into stone and carried into the next 1,000 years. This is the story of the man who never made it into any book. The man who woke before the sun in a village without a name, worked land that was never his, and watched the world change above his head while he kept his eyes on the ground. The year is 1066. England is about to be shattered and rebuilt. 3 battles in a single year. 2 invasions, 1 kingdom lost forever. But for the peasant, the villain, the cotter, the serf, none of that changes what has to be done before sunrise. The ox still needs feeding. The field still needs plowing. The Lord still needs his share. This was his life. This is what it actually looked like. The darkness before dawn in rural England in the year 1066 was not the darkness of a room with the lights off. It was total, absolute. A darkness that pressed against the eyes like something physical, the kind that makes a man unsure, for a half-second after waking, whether his eyes are open or not. He woke before the sun, because the animals woke before the sun. In the corner of the single-room cottage, a pig shifted in the straw. The smell was already there. Damp earth, animal warmth, wood smoke that never fully cleared from the air regardless of the season. The thatched roof above had turned black with years of soot. The walls were wattle and daub, sticks, mud, and animal dung packed tight into a timber frame. In October, the gap between them and warmth was measured in inches. His name is lost to history. Call him Aelric. Call him Wulfstan. Call him nothing at all, because that is closer to the truth. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after this morning, would record his village, his ox, his strips of land. It would not record him by name. He was roughly 30 years old, which, in 1066, meant he was not young. He rose from the straw pallet, wearing the same rough wool tunic he had slept in, because removing it in an English October would have been its own kind of suffering. No shoes yet. The packed earth floor was cold but familiar. He knew every inch of this room in the dark. Outside, the village was beginning to breathe. England in 1066 had somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people, scattered across thousands of settlements most modern maps have never heard of. The village our man lived in had perhaps 30 families, a church, stone, the only stone structure for miles, a mill by the stream, owned by the Lord. Fields divided into long, narrow strips running in every direction, each family working their allocation under the open field system that had organized English agriculture for generations. He grabbed a hunk of yesterday's bread from the shelf above the hearth. Dark rye, dense, slightly sour. He chewed without ceremony. This was not breakfast as an event. This was fuel before work. The bread was hard. His teeth were harder. At 30, he had already lost 2 molars. The pottage pot sat over the low embers, a thick mixture of whatever the garden had surrendered last week. Dried beans, turnips, a piece of salted pork if it had been a good month, which this month had not been. He didn't touch it yet. That was for the midday break if he got one. Outside, the sky was moving from black to a deep, bruised gray. He had perhaps 2 hours of useful daylight before the Lord's Reeve, the overseer who managed the estate on behalf of the Lord, would be walking the field boundaries to confirm the work had not merely started, but started on time. The Reeve's job was not to watch men work. It was to catch men who hadn't started yet. The ox needed water. The strips needed attention. Autumn plowing, turning the soil before the ground hardened into something a blade couldn't break. And somewhere to the south, though he did not know it yet, a king named Harold Godwinson was preparing an army for a battle that would decide the future of everything. Our man didn't know about the battle. He knew the ox. He picked up the yoke, walked to the door, and stepped into the cold. The day had begun. As it always had, as it always would. Or so he thought. He did not own the land he worked. He never had. Neither had his father. Under the Anglo-Saxon feudal structure that had shaped England for generations, a man like Elric was classified as a villain, a category that sat somewhere between a free man and a slave, depending on the day, the lord, and the mood of the reeve who enforced the rules. He held strips of land in the village's open fields. He could pass them to his sons. He could grow food on them, sell surplus at the nearest market town, maybe, in a very good year, accumulate a small reserve of grain or coin. But the land belonged to the Lord, and the Lord's demands were not requests. Every week, typically 2 to 3 days, a villain owed labor directly to the Lord's domain, the private portion of the estate the Lord farmed for his own profit. This was called week work, plowing the Lord's fields, harvesting the Lord's grain, repairing the Lord's mill. There was no payment, there was no negotiation, there was compliance, or there were consequences. On top of the week work came the seasonal obligations, boon work, additional labor demanded during planting and harvest, the 2 moments of the year when every available hand was most desperately needed. And not just any labor. The Lord's fields came first. Always first. Even if your own crops were rotting in the rain while you worked his. Then came the taxes. Harriet. When a villain died, his best animal went to the Lord before his family could inherit anything. The price of succession paid in livestock. Merchet. If his daughter wanted to marry a man from outside the manor, the father paid a fee for the permission. Tallage, a general tax levied at the Lord's discretion for reasons the Lord was not required to explain. And mill fees. A man could not grind his grain at home. He had to bring it to the Lord's mill and pay for the grinding in a portion of his own flour. It sounds like a system designed purely to extract. And it was. But here is the inversion that history books rarely mention. It also worked. The Lord provided something in return that no peasant could provide for himself. Protection. Not in the abstract, political sense, but in the immediate, physical sense that mattered in a world without police, without accessible courts, without any institution capable of enforcing agreements between strangers who didn't share a lord. Raiders from neighboring estates. Disputes over boundary strips that turned violent. Crop failures that required access to stored grain reserves. In this world, the Lord's power was also the Lord's guarantee. Aelric knew every clause of this arrangement. He knew which of the Lord's rules were strictly enforced and which were not. He knew the reeve's habits. When he walked the fields, when he was distracted, when a small gift of cheese might smooth over a missed morning of labor. He knew the margin between obligation and survival, and he lived inside that margin with the precision of a man whose life depended on the calculation. Because it did. The system was rigid, but the men inside it were not. That morning, Aelric guided his ox across the heavy clay soil of the Lord's southern strip, turning furrow after furrow in the gray October light. His hands were cracked and darkened from years of contact with wet soil and cold iron. The ox moved slowly, steadily. The rhythm was almost meditative, the kind of repetition that empties the mind of everything except the task directly ahead. He did not know the word feudalism. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he owed, exactly what he would receive, and exactly what would happen if the balance shifted. What he didn't know, what no peasant in England fully knew yet, was that the balance was about to shift in a way that no system of feudal law could contain. The king was about to lose his kingdom. 3 battles, 1 year, 1 island. 1066 didn't arrive quietly. It arrived like weather, sudden, total, and completely indifferent to the plans of ordinary men. It began in January, when King Edward the Confessor died without a clear heir. Within 24 hours, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, had claimed the throne. Within months, two other men had decided they had better claims. One was Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last of the great Viking kings, who believed a promise made decades earlier entitled him to the English crown. The other was William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had personally promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support that promise. Two invasions were coming. Harold knew it. His earls knew it. His soldiers knew it. And somewhere in the English countryside, Elric knew something was wrong because the Lord's manor had gone quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes something loud. The Anglo-Saxon military system required men of fighting age to serve in the fired, the national militia called up in times of crisis. Not all men, and not always. But in a crisis year, the call went wide. Elric's oldest son, perhaps 16, perhaps 17, had been taken into the local levy in the summer. No ceremony, no farewell feast. A reeve arrived in the village with a list, pointed at 3 young men, and that was all there was to it. September 20th, the Battle of Fulford Gate. Harold Hardrada's Viking army crushed a northern English force in a single, brutal engagement. York fell. The north of England was in Viking hands. Harold marched his army north in 4 days, a pace military historians still consider remarkable, and 5 days later, on September 25th, smashed Hardrada's forces at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada himself was killed. 300 Viking ships had arrived on the English coast. 24 sailed home. It should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast with approximately 7,000 men. Cavalry, archers, infantry, and the logistics of a professional military force the Anglo-Saxons had no direct equivalent to match. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched south. October 14th, the Battle of Hastings. Roughly 9 hours of fighting on a hillside in Sussex. Harold Godwinson died. The details of his death remain disputed, but he died, and with him, Anglo-Saxon England. Elric witnessed none of this. He was 60 miles from Hastings, turning soil that still needed turning regardless of who was king. But the war came to him anyway. Armies move through countryside. They eat what the countryside produces. Norman foraging parties didn't pause to distinguish between hostile territory and neutral farmsteads. Hungry soldiers are hungry soldiers, regardless of whose banner they march under. Villages near the routes of march were stripped, animals taken, grain stores emptied. Men who resisted were dealt with quickly. Some villages were burned as examples. The son Elric had watched walk away in September did not come home in October, or in November, or ever. He was not listed among the dead at Hastings. He was simply gone, one of thousands of English soldiers who disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing military campaign, and left no trace in any document that survived. Elric kept working, not because he wasn't grieving, but because grief in 1066 did not pause the harvest. The grain still needed to come in before the frost. The ox still needed feeding. The Lord, whoever the Lord turned out to be once the dust of conquest settled, would still want his share. This is what war looks like from the bottom. Not glory, not flags, not brave men making their last stand on a ridge. A father, a missing son, a field that still needed plowing. There was one building in Elric's village made of stone. Not his home, packed earth and wattle, same as every other home on the lane. not the Lord's Hall, timber, though larger and better timbered than anything the villagers lived in. The church, small, cold, with narrow windows that admitted more wind than light, but stone. The only permanent structure in a world where almost everything else rotted, burned, or blew away inside of a generation. The Church of England in 1066 was Anglo-Saxon Christianity, different in texture and practice from the Norman Church that William would impose in the years following the conquest. Less bureaucratic, more local, more human. The village priest was often barely educated, barely distinguishable from his congregation in poverty and daily rhythm. He farmed strips in the open fields like everyone else. He was sometimes married, or as close to married as the rural church was willing to look past. But his role was irreplaceable. The church controlled time. In a world without mechanical clocks, reliable timekeeping wouldn't reach England for another 2 centuries. The year was organized entirely by the liturgical calendar. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, the feast days of dozens of saints, each marking a point in the agricultural cycle. When to plant, when to harvest, when to slaughter the pigs before the worst of winter arrived. The church didn't only offer spiritual direction, it was the operating system of the year itself. Sundays were rest, mandatory, enforced not by law, but by a combination of social pressure and genuine faith. In a life of relentless physical labor, the Sabbath was not merely religious obligation. It was survival. The body required it, whether the theology was understood or not. Elric believed, not in the abstract philosophical way of theologians in their stone monasteries. He believed in the immediate, physical, desperate way of a man for whom the difference between a good harvest and starvation was real, annual, and never guaranteed. He believed God watched his fields. He believed that sin could sour milk and rot grain. He believed that the priest's blessing on the plowshare at Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, the ceremonial start of each new plowing season, was not symbolic. It was necessary, a practical transaction between man and heaven. But underneath the Christian surface, something older moved. Anglo-Saxon England carried the memory of its pre-Christian past in its bones and in its language. The days of the week still bore the names of Norse gods: Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day. The word Easter itself likely derived from a pre-Christian spring tradition. In the forests at the edge of the fields, in the language of herbal remedies passed between women, in the half-whispered explanations for sudden illness, bad luck, and deaths that made no sense, the old world breathed alongside the new one, as it had for generations. Certain trees were not to be cut without reason. Boundary stones marked not just property lines, but something older than property. The village priest preached against these beliefs on Sundays, then occasionally consulted them privately during the week. After news of Hastings reached the village, arriving days later, in fragments, half rumor, each version slightly different from the last, Elric went to the church. He knelt on the stone floor. He stayed there long enough for the cold to enter his knees and settle there. He did not pray for England. He prayed for his son. He did not have a framework for what Norman conquest meant or for the restructuring of ecclesiastical authority that William would impose over the following decade. He didn't have words for the transformation that was coming, for the way the language of power itself was about to change around him. He had a father's prayer in a cold stone building. And outside, in the November dark, the trees at the edge of the village stood the way they always had, ancient, indifferent, and full of something no one had ever managed to name. He had always known it was there. He went home, and in the morning, he went back to work. The Norman conquest did not arrive in Aelric's village as a single dramatic moment. There was no announcement, no formal transition, no day on which a man could point and say, "That is when everything changed." It arrived slowly, in pieces, like water finding its way through stone. First came the new lord. Within years of Hastings, William the Conqueror had redistributed virtually all of England's landholdings. By 1086, 20 years after the battle, the Domesday Book would reveal that out of roughly 4,000 named landholders in England before the conquest, fewer than 100 were still English. The rest had been replaced by Normans, William's knights, his allies, his creditors, men who had crossed the Channel on the promise of English soil and received exactly what was promised. The Lord Aelric had known, the man whose rules he had memorized, whose reeve he had spent years learning to manage, whose system he had navigated with the precision of long practice, was gone, replaced by someone who spoke a different language, observed different customs, and had no particular reason to honor the informal arrangements that had made the old system livable. The language itself began to shift. The new lords spoke Norman French. Their stewards spoke Norman French. The courts that carried real power over land and life operated in Norman French. English, the language of Aelric and his family and every person he had ever known, was becoming the language of the low. Within 2 generations, it would effectively split in two. French above, English below. They would not fully fuse again for 300 years. And when they did, the result would be the language you are listening to right now. But Aelric didn't live to see the fusion. He lived long enough to feel the fracture. The taxes tightened. The labor obligations increased. The Normans were efficient administrators in a way the Anglo-Saxon system had never quite demanded. Where the old arrangement had allowed certain flexibilities, the gap between rule and enforcement that Aelric had spent his life exploiting, the new order moved methodically to close those gaps. In 1085, King William ordered the most thorough administrative survey England had ever seen. Every manor, every village, every measure of land, every ox, every pig, every mill. Commissioners rode out across the country with identical questions for every settlement. Who holds this land? What is it worth now? What was it worth before the conquest? And what has changed? The survey was so complete, so relentless, so final in its judgments that the English gave it a name drawn from the Old English word for doom, as in the Last Judgment, the day when all things are counted and no appeal is possible. The Domesday Book. Aelric's village appears in it. His ox appears in it. His strips of land appear in it, reassigned to a Norman lord, whose name is recorded in the careful Latin of William's clerks. Aelric does not appear in it, not by name, not as an individual. He is part of the tally, a number inside a category, indistinguishable from the men who worked beside him, buried their dead beside him, shared the same cold church in the same cold November. The most complete administrative record of medieval England contains no trace of who he was as a person. And yet, he fed people. For decades, in a small village in a cold country, he woke before the sun and worked until the light was gone and fed his family and his lord, and the civilization being constructed above his head without his permission or his input. The kings are remembered. The battles have names. The Normans left their castles standing in stone. But England, the actual ground of it, the plowed and planted and harvested and frost-broken ground, that was his work. His hands, his ox, his sons, the ones who came back and the ones who didn't. History did not remember him, but everything history built was standing on what he left behind. If you stayed until the end, you already understand something most people never stop long enough to consider, that the foundation of every great civilization was carried by people history chose to forget. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell because every episode goes deeper into the lives that changed the world from the ground up. And before you go, leave us a comment. If you had been born in England in 1066, would you have stayed or would you have run?